Calvin Bryce only meant to slide the overnight bag into the overhead rack and get his daughter settled front and pulled away from Union Station. But his hand stopped halfway, and he stood there in the aisle, without moving it. Through the scratched window, the platform below was nearly empty. Ground crew was pulling the last of the luggage carts away. The afternoon was gray in the particular way that November in Toronto is gray, not dramatically dark, but flat and uniform, the kind of sky that makes everything beneath it look slightly faded. It wasn't the platform that stopped him. It was the sound. A vibration, low and irregular, coming from somewhere beneath the floor of the car. Not the steady idle hum of a train sitting at station with its engines warming, something intermittent, a pulse that arrived, held for 3 seconds, then went quiet, then came back, slightly changed. The way a sound changes when the thing producing it is working against itself. Calvin had spent 11 years listening to machinery the way other men listened to music. He had learned early in his career that most mechanical failures announce themselves long before they became catastrophic, and that the interval between announcement and catastrophe was exactly as long as people chose to take the announcement seriously. He lowered his arm, he put the bag on the seat. Dad. His daughter Andy was 8 years old and had her mother's way of watching him when she thought something was wrong. She was sitting by the window with her backpack in her lap and her dark hair in 2 braids that he had done that morning. Badly, in the kitchen, before they left the house. She was looking at him with a measured attention that was too old for her face, the way children look when they have learned that the adults around them sometimes need to be watched carefully. He told her everything was fine. He meant it conditionally. He crouched slightly and pressed one hand flat against the floor of the car, the way he did when diagnosing vibration in industrial equipment. The pulse was there, irregular, not structural resonance from the station infrastructure and not a routine diesel idle. It was coming from one of the truck assemblies beneath the car. The coupling end, if he had to guess, the rear-facing side. He had spent 3 years studying exactly this kind of harmonic signature in rail coupling systems, and he knew what it meant when the pattern broke unevenly. He straightened and found the nearest crew member. Her name tag read Tara Milson. He would learn later, 8 years with Via Rail, efficient and direct, and very good at the work she had been hired to do, which on that particular trip included managing a full passenger manifest and a departure that was already 6 minutes behind schedule because of a platform loading delay. Calvin told her about the vibration. He described it without drama or urgency, the way he always described mechanical observations, specific, sequential, without emotional color. He told her it was coming from the rear truck assembly, that the pulse pattern was inconsistent, in a way that suggested either a coupling bracket under uneven load stress or a bearing issue in the bogie frame, and that in either case he thought it warranted a check before the train moved. Tara looked at him. He was wearing a gray work jacket with a crease across the left shoulder from where Andy had slept on him in the cab from Scarborough. He had not shaved in 2 days. The bag on his seat was the kind of nylon duffel that had been washed enough times to look permanently soft. He did not look like someone who spent his evenings reading Transport Canada, mechanical safety standards, which he did. She told him, professionally and without hostility, that Via Rail trains underwent full mechanical inspection before every departure, that the train had been cleared that morning, and that any vibration he was feeling was normal operating noise from the station environment. Calvin said he understood that, and that he still thought the pattern he was describing was worth a second look. She said, more firmly, and with a small smile she was probably not aware of, that if he would like to raise a concern through the proper channel, he was welcome to speak with passenger services after they were underway. She said it in the tone of someone resolving a situation rather than responding to a question. He said quietly, A bearing failure on a coupling bracket under cold weather thermal stress doesn't announce itself after you're moving. It announces itself now while the train is stationary and the differential load is static. At speed, you lose the diagnostic window entirely. There were other passengers nearby. 2 men in business suits across the aisle. A woman with a toddler in the row ahead who had half turned in her seat. A man in a CN rail cap behind them who had stopped looking at his phone. Tara Milson's expression completed its shift into something more formal. She said clearly, and in a voice pitched at a volume that was professionally controlled but not private, that she appreciated his concern, but that he needed to trust that the train was safe, and that if he was not comfortable with how trains worked, she could assist him in making alternative travel arrangements. A short sound came from the men in suits, not quite a laugh. Something between amusement and commiseration, directed at no one in particular. Andy had been looking out the window. She stopped looking out the window. She pulled her backpack onto her lap and wrapped both arms around it and looked at her shoes. She was 8 years old. She had not taken a long train trip since before her mother died. She had spent the week before this trip telling Calvin she was excited and asking whether the train had a proper dining car and whether you could see Lake Ontario from the right side or the left. She had been braver about everything in the last 18 months than a child her age should have to be, with a quietness about her courage that Calvin found both admirable and difficult to witness. Now she was looking at her shoes. Calvin felt this the way he felt most things he could not control, as a specific pressure located somewhere behind his sternum that he acknowledged and then set to one side because something else required his attention. He told Tara Milson, without raising his voice and without performance, that he did not require her to agree with him. He only required her to pass the observation to someone with the mechanical authority to evaluate it. He said that a coupling bracket showing this vibration signature under static load at station would behave differently once thermal contraction set in at outdoor temperatures in November in southern Ontario. He said that if there was nothing wrong, the inspection would confirm it and they would lose perhaps 15 minutes. He said that if there was something wrong, 15 minutes was a very different kind of number. She reached for her radio. In the engineer's cab at the front of the train, the chief mechanical officer on duty that afternoon was a man named Hugh Devereaux. 22 years with Via Rail, 12 of them in safety oversight, and the kind of quiet professional who had long since learned to distrust anyone who dismissed mechanical concerns on the basis of schedule pressure. He had heard Tara's radio call. He had heard the neutral, slightly sardonic tone of someone reporting an unusual passenger. He had heard the car number and the row. Then Tara Milson, consulting the passenger manifest for the booking reference, gave him the name attached to the seat. Calvin Bryce. Hugh set down the pre-departure form in his hand. He picked up the radio and asked her to repeat the name. She repeated it. She did not understand why he was asking. He told her to hold the departure. He told her he would be there in 4 minutes. He said this in the tone of a man who had already decided something and was communicating the decision, not discussing it. Hugh Devereaux had not thought about the Bryce coupling assessment in years. It had crossed his desk almost a decade ago, passed along by a colleague at a rail safety symposium, who had mentioned it the way people mention things they consider underappreciated, briefly, without ceremony, in the margin of a larger conversation. It was a 40-page engineering document, dense with vibration data and thermal cycle modeling, authored by a structural analyst named Calvin Bryce, who had at that time been employed by a rail systems contractor based in Mississauga. The document analyzed a specific failure mode in coupling bracket assemblies, used across a significant portion of Via Rail's aging fleet. It described how the combination of inadequate inspection intervals and cold weather thermal contraction could produce microfractures that were invisible to standard visual inspection, but would propagate under the oscillating load stress of a moving train. It recommended an enhanced inspection protocol keyed to temperature thresholds and identified exactly which coupling bracket generations were most at risk. The document had never been formally adopted. Hugh had heard, through the same informal channels that carried most of the information that actually mattered in his industry, that the author had attempted to raise the findings through his employer's internal process, and had eventually been let go during a restructuring that produced no documentation connecting his departure to the assessment. The document existed in a kind of limbo, referenced in footnotes, cited in safety training materials, but never acted on at the level its findings warranted. Hugh had used it in a safety briefing 4 years ago. He had found it more useful than half the formally cushioned reports he had read that year. He had never expected to hear that name on a passenger manifest. He walked out of the engineer's cab. It was not something he did during pre-departure without announcement, and the effect moved through the crew the way unusual things always moved, quickly and without quite settling into words. He walked the length of 3 cars and stopped at row 14. The man sitting there was not what Hugh had constructed in his mind from the document. Technical authors existed in a particular abstraction, methodical, credentialed, institutional. The man in row 14 was wearing a work jacket and had a child sitting beside him with her braids coming slightly loose on one side, and he had the look of someone who had been awake since before dawn and had simply decided that was not worth remarking on. Hugh asked him directly whether he was Calvin Bryce, the one who had written the coupling fatigue assessment for the Mississauga Rail Systems Group. The car went quiet. Calvin looked at him for a moment. He said yes. He said it without pride and without resentment, and without the weariness of a man who had spent years being asked about something painful. He said it the way a person states a biographical fact that is accurate and complete and does not require elaboration. Hugh told him to show him what he had heard. They stood at the vestibule between cars, crouched near the floor access panel, while Calvin described the vibration. He did not perform the description. He gave it the same way he gave all mechanical observations, sequential, specific, without editorializing. He said, the pulse arrived in 3-second intervals, with a frequency drop on the 3rd beat, that suggested the load was not distributed evenly across the bracket points. He said the cold had been -12 overnight, and that the thermal contraction coefficient for the grade of steel used in that generation of coupling bracket was something he could cite from memory, and did. Hugh listened in the way that Calvin recognized immediately, not politely, not with the professional courtesy people used as a substitute for attention, but with the actual attention of someone processing information and comparing it to an internal model, and finding that the comparison was producing a result that required action. He called the maintenance crew. The mechanic who responded was a man named Roy, 15 years on the Via Rail maintenance team at Union Station, who arrived with the efficient composure of someone whose entire professional culture was built around not appearing alarmed. Roy checked the coupling bracket with a flashlight. He checked it again. He asked Calvin to describe the sound a 3rd time, and Calvin described it precisely as he had before, and Roy pressed his ear to the metal panel and was quiet for a long time. What Roy found was not a full fracture. It was a propagating microcrack running along the upper bearing seat of the coupling bracket, barely visible even under direct light. The kind of thing that standard visual inspection was not designed to catch, because standard visual inspection was designed for a different category of problem. Under the thermal expansion of a running engine over a 200-kilometer run in November cold, it was the kind of crack that completed itself. Roy took 3 photographs. He called his supervisor. The passengers were moved to an adjacent car while the train was held for inspection. It took 40 minutes. Calvin sat with Andy near the far end of the coach, near a window looking out at the station platform, where ground crew moved in the flat gray afternoon light. Andy had stopped looking at her shoes. She was watching the platform with the composed attention of someone who had decided, at some point in the last half hour, that whatever was happening was not something she needed to be afraid of. She had made this decision, Calvin understood, approximately, when she watched the chief mechanical officer of the train crouch beside her father, and listened to him the way people listened when something mattered. She had not said anything about Tara Milson and the things that had been said in the car. She did not need to. A Transport Canada rail safety officer named Vera Lamb arrived at Union Station 45 minutes after Roy's photographs were submitted to the regional safety desk. She was calm and specific in the way that good inspectors were calm and specific, and her arrival changed the register of every conversation from operational to investigative. She reviewed the photographs and the bracket data. She reviewed the maintenance logs for the car. She asked the station maintenance supervisor a series of questions in a tone that was professional and courteous, and left no ambiguity about what she was actually asking. Then she asked to speak with the passenger who had identified the coupling condition. She found Calvin near the far end of the coach with Andy beside him, eating a granola bar from her backpack and reading a chapter book with the deliberate concentration of a child who has decided to be busy and useful and not in the way. Vera introduced herself. She said she intended to cross-reference the bracket failure pattern against the original Bryce coupling assessment. She said that if the microfracture propagation matched the failure sequence Calvin had documented 9 years ago, the scope of the review would need to expand to include other cars in the same maintenance pool. Calvin heard this and said nothing for a moment. He looked out the window at the flat November platform, at the crew moving with purpose and care under portable lights. He thought about the years between the document and this afternoon. They had not been nothing. He had found work. He had raised Andy. He had, with genuine effort, stopped being consumed by what had been done to his work, which was different from forgetting it. He said, with the same quietness he used for everything, the microfracture pattern would match. He said the failure sequence in his assessment was not speculative. It was modeled from metallurgical data and 30 years of thermal cycling records. He said that any review, which focused only on this specific bracket and not on the maintenance culture that had failed to catch it, was going to produce a finding without a correction. Vera took notes. She was, Calvin observed, the kind of person who wrote things down. In his experience, this was one of the more reliable markers of someone who intended to actually use what they were being told. He said, half to himself and half to the room, rail systems don't fail because of one small signal. They fail when enough people in a row decide small signals aren't worth slowing down for. Vera wrote that down too. The train that eventually left Union Station was a different set of coaches, reassigned from the yard. It departed 1 hour and 20 minutes behind schedule. The man in the CN rail cap, who had watched everything from row 12 and said nothing during any of it, walked past Calvin before boarding the replacement train and paused. He said, without elaborating, that he was glad someone had said something. Calvin thanked him and meant it plainly. Tara Milson found Calvin at the boarding door just before the new departure. She had had 1 hour and 20 minutes to decide what to say, and she had arrived at the conclusion that what she had available to her was inadequate, which meant the only question was whether inadequate was better than nothing. She said she hadn't known who he was. Calvin looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You didn't need to know who I was. You needed to pass what I said to someone who could check it. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing." He said it without sharpness. He said it the way a person states something they believe to be simply true, and have believed for long enough that it no longer carries much emotional weight in the saying. Tara Milson was quiet. She had anticipated a version of this conversation, where she apologized and received something like acceptance, and the transaction was complete. What she found instead was the sense that the conversation was about something larger than what she had done, about a habit, about a pattern, about the gap between what gets passed upward and what gets filtered out at the first point of contact. She turned to Andy and apologized to her directly. She had not planned to do this. Once she started, it felt like the correct part of the apology, the part that acknowledged that a child had been made to sit through her father's humiliation in public. Andy looked at her with the gravity of an 8-year-old who had considered the matter carefully. She said it was okay. She said it in the tone that meant it was okay, and also that she would be thinking about it for a while longer. Calvin told Tara Milson that the most useful thing she could do with what had happened was to build a different habit. Not the apology, the habit. The next time a passenger said something that made her impatient, to pass it upward rather than resolve it at the point of contact, because the point of contact was not always where the relevant expertise lived. She said she understood. He said the next time would be the actual measure of that. She absorbed this without looking away from him, which Calvin respected. She said quietly that she would not do what she had done again. He said, "The next one might not wait for you to be ready." The Via Rail Regional Operations Director, a man named Paul Ackerman, met briefly with Calvin in the station's private waiting lounge while the replacement coaches were being prepared. He was accompanied by a safety liaison who had driven in from the regional office in Mississauga. Paul said the carrier was taking the coupling assessment findings seriously and that the maintenance deviations would be fully documented and reported to Transport Canada. He said the way Calvin's report had been handled in the car was not consistent with how Via Rail wanted its crews to respond to passenger safety concerns. He asked whether Calvin would be willing to be considered for a consulting engagement related to the coupling bracket inspection program. Calvin did not answer immediately. He looked out the window of the lounge at the platform where Roy and 2 other mechanics were working on the coupling assembly, under portable lights, methodical and careful and serious about what they were doing. He thought about the offer the way he thought about most things, not with the quick, reflexive response of someone who already knew what they wanted, but with the slower attention of someone who understood that the first answer was not always the honest one. He had been hurt by this industry, not once, dramatically, but in increments, each small enough to absorb individually, the cumulative weight of which had become clear only gradually, the way you don't notice how tired you are until you sit down. He also thought about Andy, who was in the lounge doorway eating Timbits that someone on the crew had brought for the waiting passengers and who would start grade 3 in January, and who had asked him last week whether the work he did now, maintaining industrial compressors for a parts facility in Brampton, was something he liked. He had told her honestly that it was useful and that he was good at it. He had not told her it was the work he had built himself to do. He said he would consider the consulting role under 3 conditions. He said first, the crew training that followed from this incident needed to address not just the technical criteria for passing safety reports upward, but the assumption that got in the way. The assumption that the value of a mechanical observation depended on whether the person making it looked like a credible source. That assumption was the failure point. Any training that did not address it directly was not addressing the actual problem. He said second, the maintenance deviation findings needed to be shared broadly across the rail maintenance community, not filed internally and resolved at the level of a single inspection. The condition he had identified that afternoon had been documented in his assessment 9 years ago. 9 years of standard inspections had not caught it, because standard inspection intervals had been designed before his assessment existed. The industry needed to know this, not just the carrier. he said third. The original coupling assessment needed to be formally entered into the Transport Canada Technical Reference Archive. Not for his sake, because it contained documented analysis that was still accurate and still relevant, and had been sitting unused for nearly a decade while the trains it had tried to protect continued running. Paul Ackerman said all three conditions were ones he could pursue formally. He said he would have a proposal drafted within the week. Calvin said he would wait for it. He said he was not interested in returning to the industry to prove something he already knew was true. He said he was only willing to return if the return produced outcomes that helped the people riding these trains get safely from one city to another, and if it built the kind of institutional memory that didn't require another Calvin Bryce to happen to be sitting in the right seat on the right day. He left the lounge and collected Andy from the doorway, where she was on her fourth timbit and looking out at the mechanics on the platform with the focused curiosity of a child working to understand what she was watching. She asked what the men were fixing. He said they were fixing something that would have broken later if they hadn't fixed it now. She thought about this. She said, "How did they know it was broken?" He said, "Someone told them." She looked at him. She looked back at the men on the platform. She seemed to be placing these two facts into some arrangement that made sense to her, filing them away alongside other things she had collected that afternoon. On the replacement train, Andy took the window seat without being asked. She had chosen it. Calvin found this quietly significant in the way that small choices children make in the aftermath of frightening things are always significant. The decision to look out at something rather than away from it. The conductor made a brief announcement before departure. He said the delay had been the result of a maintenance condition identified during boarding that had been properly assessed and addressed. He said the system had worked as it was supposed to work. He said a passenger had brought the condition to the crew's attention and that the crew's responsibility at that point had been to listen. He did not name Calvin. He did not need to. The people who had been on the original train knew. Some of them had been watching Calvin since the maintenance crew arrived. The ones who had smiled or looked away earlier were now engaged in a quiet internal revision that was uncomfortable but necessary. Andy had her notebook out. She wrote something carefully in the deliberate block printing of a child who was taking the words seriously. She did not show it to him. He did not ask. The train moved out of Union Station and the city opened up around them. The back of the office towers, the lake briefly visible to the south, then the residential spread of the East End giving way to the flat winter gray of the countryside. Andy fell asleep against his arms somewhere before Cobourg, the way she had as a smaller child, when the world was still sorted cleanly into things that felt safe and things that didn't, and he had been the primary mechanism for moving between the two. She was older now. She did some of that sorting herself, but not all of it. He looked out the window. The fields were pale and flat in the late afternoon. The sky was the particular dark gray of November in Ontario just before the light goes. The train held a steady speed, the couplings moving with the solid rhythmic certainty of components functioning as they were designed to function, checked and confirmed, and trusted because the check had been done properly. In the weeks that followed, Via Rail completed a thermal threshold inspection of all coupling brackets in the same maintenance pool as the Toronto train. 7 brackets were flagged for replacement. A formal report was filed with Transport Canada, documenting the inspection deviation and its correction. Vera Lamb's office cross-referenced the findings against the original Bryce coupling assessment and submitted a formal citation request to the Transport Canada Technical Archive, where the document was reclassified from informal submission to referenced engineering finding, a small administrative change with a weight that Calvin felt when he read the notification on a Tuesday morning in his kitchen. While Andy was eating oatmeal and arguing gently with him about whether she needed a hat for school because it was only -7. He put his phone face down on the counter and poured his coffee. He told her she needed the hat. The formal consulting proposal arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks later. He read it at his workbench in Brampton, with a replacement bearing assembly waiting beside it. The proposal included all 3 of the conditions he had named, rendered into the formal language of a contract, which was not the same as a guarantee, but was the form a commitment took when the people making it intended it to be taken seriously. He called Andy's school. He asked when the winter term career presentations were scheduled. When she came home that afternoon, he told her he was thinking about going back to a kind of work he used to do. She asked what kind. He said, work that involved figuring out when things that moved people from one place to another were safe, and when they weren't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, like on the train. He said something like that. She nodded the slow nod of a child who is filing information away for later. Then she went to get her after-school snack because she was 8 years old and had her priorities in order. He accepted the consulting engagement the following week, structured part-time around Andy's school calendar, with the formal archive citation for his coupling assessment written into the terms. He did not accept it to be vindicated. He did not accept it to be known. He accepted it because there was a version of this industry that was less likely to do what it had done that gray November afternoon at Union Station, less likely to let a crew member's quick read of a man's jacket and duffel bag and unremarkable face add up to a decision not to pass a safety report upward. And if the path to that version of the industry ran through his specific knowledge and his specific willingness to walk back into rooms that had once arranged themselves to leave him out, then that was the work. That had always been the work. When Andy stood at the front of her classroom in January for the winter career presentations, she did not introduce her father as the man who fixed industrial equipment. She did not introduce him as the man who used to work on trains. She introduced him as the man who listened to a sound in the floor of a train on a gray November afternoon, said out loud what he heard, and kept saying it until someone with the authority to act on it was standing in the same aisle. Calvin sat in the back of the classroom in a chair sized for a 7-year-old, and listened to his daughter describe him, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, though it was related to pride, and not relief exactly, though it contained relief. Something simpler than both. The particular lightness of a person who has been carrying something quietly for years, and has finally been seen carrying it clearly, without reduction, by someone whose seeing matters most. That afternoon at Union Station, when Tara Milson had looked at his jacket and his quiet, watchful daughter, and decided the calculation was not in his favor, she had missed something she would spend a long time correcting. But when Hugh Devereaux heard his name, an entire train full of people learned what the industry had been slow to absorb. That the most important voice at the right moment is not always the one attached to the most credentialed-looking person in the car, and that the warning no one wanted to hear was precisely the one that needed most urgently to go forward.